Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our History Highlights series. My name is Annie Black, and I'm the Director of Programs and Volunteers at the museum. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to our community partners for tonight, Dallas Jewish Historical Society, George W. Bush Presidential Center, International Rescue Committee in Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, SMU Human Rights Program, Southwest Jewish Congress, and Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. Thank you all so much for your ongoing support of the museum and these events. A quick note before I introduce our speaker for tonight, we will have time at the end of the program for questions. So if you do have a question sometime during the program, please feel free to open that Q&A function. It's likely at the bottom of your screen if you are on a computer, and it might be at the top if you are on a tablet or phone. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Charlotte Decoster, Director of Education at the museum.
Thank you, Annie, and we'll get just started right away. I'm gonna share my screen here and hopefully get a, making sure, check in from Annie and Spencer that they can see my screen and everything is up all right.
Good to go.
Thank you. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is going to be a little bit of a different talk. Our focus tonight is going to be the genocide in Bosnia in the 90s. I just wanted to give a little bit of a heads up. If this is a topic that you're very familiar with, I did want to let you know that today is going to be a little bit of an overview. The Bosnian Genocide is one of the examples that we use in our 10 Stages of Genocide gallery to actually highlight the stage of discrimination. So today I just wanted to give a general overview as an introduction. I'm not an expert on the Bosnian Genocide. The way I've worked with it and my studies related to the Bosnian Genocide have been in relations to our 10 Stages of Genocide gallery in the permanent exhibition. So, and in that sense, we've always presented it as an overview as well. So this is really today a presentation as an introduction to the Bosnian Genocide. So I am aware that a lot of people don't know as much information about it or know little pieces here and there. So if you do have any questions as we're going, I'll try my best to answer them. You can put your questions in the Q&A. There should be a bottom on your screen where you can post that question in. And if I don't have the answers tonight, we do have some wonderful educational partners that we work with from the United States Holocaust Museum, the Educator Institute for Human Rights, and other organizations where we can get more information and connect you to find those answers that you might have that maybe we tonight cannot answer. Also, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to share some resources as well, where you can find more answers as well, or maybe deep dive more into the history of the Bosnian Genocide. Another quick reminder that I wanted to give tonight is that this presentation does include some graphic images. That is unfortunately something we cannot avoid when talking about genocide. I am going to show some film footage as well, and I'm going to discuss several graphic topics from war violence to sexual assault and mass murder. So I do want you to be aware if there are minors watching that parents or caregivers are aware that we are going to be presenting some of that graphic information and that you should be aware of that. So to start a little bit as an introduction to the history of the events that occurred in Bosnia, I want to start first a little bit with geography. Bosnia-Herzegovina today is one of the countries within what is considered the region of the Balkans, which is nicely nestled in the middle of the Mediterranean. So if you kind of see the Mediterranean European coast between Italy and Greece there. I wanted to share kind of this map here. This is actually from during the Bosnian-Serbian War, a map here of Bosnia, and to give you kind of an understanding of the different places, because we're going to be talking about different countries, different areas, different groups, and that makes the Bosnian genocide so complex, is because we are talking about a lot of different ethnic groups, religious groups, national groups, and so I always like to start the conversation with the map here. So we are going to be talking some areas that we're going to be focusing on today within Bosnia is going to be Prejador right here, this northern area. We're going to be talking about Srebrenica right here, and that gives you kind of an idea placed where in this region of in the country of Bosnia where that is. We're also going to be talking about the before the former Yugoslavia. We're going to be talking a lot about Serbia. That's going to be one of the key main players right here, as you can see on the right-hand side. And then we're also going to be talking quite a bit about Croatia here, that kind of hugs around Bosnia as well. So that is kind of to give you a reference point when I'm talking about Croatia in the north and Serbia on the other side, that you have an understanding of where these areas are, especially because, again, all of those groups are going to have, and countries are going to have different influences on the Bosnian War. So with that little bit of geography in place, before we start actually getting to the Bosnian War and the genocide, I have to start with a little bit of introduction of history. And so I put this slide in here to kind of show you how this area of the Balkans changes historically over time, how the borders change, and the different influences that this region is going to see. As a result of these multiple influences coming in, European influences, the Ottoman Empire, Turkish rule, this area is ethnically very diverse. It is religiously very diverse, and we do have all of these different groups that are going to be seeking independence. Before World War II, and as you can, I'm going to keep that timeline kind of flowing through so you can see those continuously changing borders, and right now you can see the Ottoman Empire up, and you'll see it slowly crumbling apart, and then you'll see some of those independent states form. Then you'll see Yugoslavia forming, and then Yugoslavia falling back apart, and independent states forming again. As a result, before World War I and the Ottoman Empire's influence on the Balkans, this region saw an immense growth in Muslim populations, and many Slavs, the ethnic groups in this area, converted to Islam. More common ethnically, the Slavs who in Bosnia who converted to Islam are called Bosniaks, and I'm going to talk about this later. But this is a big part of the influence of the Ottoman Empire, that we have a religious group here, an ethnic group that is Islamic. But we're also going to see that some of these other groups have also a different religious and ethnic differences. The key kind of turning point that I really want to start focusing on in more modern time is World War II. And it's actually placed into the narrative of the genocide. Right before World War II, some of these stronger kingdoms like Serbia and other smaller states were starting to seek their, real strength of independence and started developing their own very nationalistic views. Croatia and Serbia definitely being both both of those very strong nationalistic views. By 1941, when the Nazis actually occupied this area, they created a Croat puppet state under a nationalistic regime called the Ustaše. This regime, as a puppet regime, built its own concentration camps and death camps. We are mostly familiar during the Holocaust, during World War II, of the Nazi death camps, but actually in this region, we're going to see the Jasenovac death camp as well. This is a mainly Croatian-run camp that is not targeting minorities such as Jews, but really also Serbs and other communities within this region. So it's not the first time that we see mass atrocities happen here. And that is important because these names are going to have a very big influence. You're going to hear that name Ustaše again when we get to the Bosnian War again. And actually at that point, it's going to be a derogatory term. It's going to be marking Croats as a sense and labeling them. Post-World War II, this area will come under the influence of the Soviet regime. And we have a new president here and the establishment of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which is run by Joseph Tito. And he basically creates a federation of these kind of equal republics: Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, Slovenia, and Macedonia. And he understood to keep these together, he had to, have a very, very strict rule. In a sense, he ruled like a dictator. And, there's all kinds of different views on Tito. Some see him more as a benevolent dictator. Other ones see him as a very harsh dictator that ruled with a very iron fist. But he did keep Yugoslavia, this region, united together. And he tried his best to create kind of a Yugoslav identity as well and keep it together. And so after World War II, to when we see the fall of communism and Yugoslavia breaking apart, there's this kind of uneasy unification under the former Yugoslavia that keeps these different groups that seek their independence kind of at bay, but they are ruled with a very harsh, under a very harsh rule under Tito. So that is a little bit, as short as I can make it, historical introduction to when we get closer to the 1990s and that we're going to see the Bosnian War. While these ethnic differences definitely exist in the former Yugoslavia under Tito, there's also some these differences are going to be highlighted because Tito is going to start to recognize some of them, what had not happened before. One of them is the recognition of Macedonian and of Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina as distinct nationalities. So as a result, we do not only have ethnic differences, we have national differences, and we have religious differences. And I wanted to just give you an example of just within Bosnian, how these groups differ. So for example, this is with the formation of Bosnia, 44% of the population identifies as Muslim Bosniaks. Those are people who view themselves as ethnically Bosnian, nationally Bosnian, and religiously Muslim. 32% of the population in Bosnia sees themselves as Bosnian Serb. They are Orthodox Serb religiously and ethnically Serbian. And national-wise, they see them either self-aligning as Bosnian Serbs or as Serbs. So nationally closer to the country of Serbia. Then there's also Croats. Croats identify religiously as Catholic, and they ethnically identify as Croats and frequently nationally as Croats as well, with the country of Croatia, which gets formed after the collapse of former Yugoslavia as well, and also see themselves ethnically as Bosnian Croats. So, and then we have another small group of others, right, that see themselves as ethnically different. For example, Jews. There's Jews living in this area too. A few years ago at the museum, we had a wonderful presentation of how Jews aided the Muslim population in Bosnia during the Bosnian War, especially with the siege of Sarajevo. So we have another category of, other groups, but the big three groups are going to be religiously identifying as Muslim, Orthodox Serb, Catholic Croats, and then ethnically as Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats. So this, makes this a very diverse, multi-ethnic, multi-religious region. This was all held together, right? This is on the larger spectrum, was also under the former Yugoslavia, but Tito did keep this together. With the collapse of Yugoslavia, we're going to see a big split. First of all, Serbia, which was really the center, Belgrade had become the center in Serbia of former Yugoslavia, really sought to keep everything together and create a kind of centralized control, a centralized state led, of course, by Serbia. This is a very Serbian nationalistic view. Of course, the other countries, the other groups around Serbia did not feel that way. They instead wanted a very decentralized state, either a federalization of different states or independence. And so very quickly, several of these areas are going to seek their independence. Slovenia and Croatia being the first ones, they held elections to form governments and seek independence on their own, split away, not under the control of Serbia. While Serbia is very worried about Slovenia, their main focus is Croatia, and this is going to start really friction and eventually war between Serbia and Croatia. Croatia had about 600,000 Serbs living within Croatia, who of course very well remembered the atrocities during World War II that I just referenced, and death camps and camps like Jasenovac. And they definitely did not want to fall under a Croat state. The Croats, on their part, viewed Serbs as always having benefited from Soviet influence, from living under communism, and they did not want them around either. And that already started the friction, a Serb uprising once the Croatian War had started, and the Croat-Serb War right there. So keep in mind when I'm talking a little bit about the Bosnian War that the conflict between Serbia is not just with Bosnia and with Bosnian Muslims. Serbia will also be at war and target Croats as well, Bosnian Croats and Croatia in that. So I hope everybody, again, if you have questions, please put it in the chat. If I'm going too fast or you want me to repeat it, again, as I said originally, this is kind of a basic overview of these different groups, and it can get very complex with that. So in this struggle for a centralized state that Serbian nationalists were seeking, and a very decentralized state and independence that other ethnic groups were seeking, a lot of this conflict start arising, especially Serbia under Milosevic, Slobodan Milosevic, you can start here, already in the late 1980s, really starts pushing for a very nationalistic view of what this, a very Serb view of what this new Yugoslavia should look like, this centralized state should look like. For example, the Serbian military was slowly transforming to be 90% Serbian and not allowing other ethnic groups in it. It started taking over the financial sector, media sector, security structures within Serbia, excluding other ethnic groups. And of course, regions around that started noticing that. This, of course, drove, again, even more that seeking of independence for these other ethnic groups. So this brings us all the way up in very fast forward to 1992. On February 29th, following Croatia, Bosnia starts seeking its independence, and it holds two referendums, the first one actually being on February 29th, the second one being on March 1st. And this referendum was held to see if an independent social republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina should be created. The Bosnian Serb leadership so Serbs living in Bosnia and their leaders immediately called for a boycott against these referendums. They asked all Bosnian Serbs to not participate. The result was that there was a 63.7% turnout for this referendum. So still very high, but 92.7% voting in favor for the independence. But what we also notice is that 34%, which was approximately the population of Bosnian Serbs in 92, did not vote. They did come out, and they did not come out, and they did block the referendum and thus did not vote. So this could be used by Serbia, the country, and by Bosnian Serbs as an excuse to show that they were being excluded from Bosnian society, that their voice was not being heard. Immediately, this resulted in Bosnian Serbs gathering together, starting arming, forming militias, building roadblocks, connecting with Serbia itself, and building a small force to prepare for potential war. And then after the second referendum on March 1, Bosnia on March 3rd declared its independence. At that point, we had already, when this declaration happened of independence, these roadblocks were set up. Bosnian Serb militias, such as the Republika Srpska, were already formed. They were already in action and were already operating within Bosnia. So tensions were extremely high already, and preparations for war were already obvious. On April 6th, the European community recognized Bosnia's independence. And this is really what started kicking off the start of what in journalistic terms came out as ethnic cleansing. And so I am going to use several of these terms, from mass atrocities to ethnic cleansing and genocide. Do be aware that there is no full illegal definition for ethnic cleansing. It is originally a journalistic term that comes into the language and refers to expulsion of an ethnic group out of that area. Now, in many of these cases, when we look at Bosnia, we can see either genocide happen, or like we display in our museum, you can see the process of genocide enacting. This is why we also stress at the museum to look at the 10 stages of genocide, that it is not just slowly about the actual stage of extermination, the actual event, as we'll see in Srebrenica, but all the events leading up to it are part of this process of genocide. So that ethnic cleansing term and the ethnic cleansing events that we're going to start seeing in 92, starting in April of 92, are definitely part of it. Because the idea behind it is, the Serbian notion behind this is for an expulsion of all Muslims and Croats from Serbia and Bosnia, from these areas, that would be enacted by Serbian militias, and they would, Bosnian Serb militias, that would slowly take over Bosnia and basically create a greater Serbia. So, so those terms are very complex, but rather than just focus on defining and labeling each, I do want to look at some of that process of genocide. So rather, instead than keeping referring to this is this and this is that and putting the labels on it, I am going to use some terms from the 10 stages of genocide to show how that process of genocide is already enacting right before we actually get to the Srebrenica genocide itself. And we just had a question coming in. Bosnia declares its independence. No, former Yugoslavia had already broken up, so it actually declares itself in this state independence from Serbia, independent on its own. Milosevic already rises to power in the 1980s when Tito falls away. So he fills that leadership position after the collapse of former Yugoslavia, but already before that. So he is already part of the Serbian leadership in the 1980s. And that was the question is, how does Milosevic rise to power? So I want to go really quick over the factions again, because when I'm talking about this, I'll talk about the different militias and the different army groups, and I just wanted to kind of lay them out first because they can become very complex. Sometimes I even confuse them as well. So I just wanted to kind of go through them really briefly so you have an understanding of the different militias and army groups. So first of all, you have the Bosnians are Bosniaks. Those are Bosnian Muslims. They are loyal. They are for the promotion of this independent state, to protect this independent state of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Their army is the Army of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So that one is an easy one to follow. Then you have Croats. Croats can be Bosnian Croats that are living in Bosnia, or they can be Croats from Croatia, the country, the neighboring country, as I showed you, that kind of hugs around Bosnia. They are loyal to the creation of a Croatian Republic of Herzegovina, Bosnia, and they're also loyal to Croatia. So they want to create a Croat state within Bosnia, and they're also loyal to the country of Croatia. So two different things in that. There you have the Croat Defense Council. That is the militia within Bosnia, and they are supported by the Croatian Army, the HV, and the Croatian Defense Forces, HOS. So there, the country of Croatia is supporting armed support as well, besides the the Bosnian Croat militias within Bosnia. Then the Serbs, who often refer themselves as the Yugoslavs as well. Again, they want to create this big centralized in Serbia, this greater Serbia, right? That would include Croatia and Bosnia. They want to create the Republika Srpska, which is a Serb Bosnian state within Bosnia, Serb controlled. Or they want to go back to what is are loyal to Serbia or the structure of former Yugoslavia, so under control of Serbia, centralized control. The militia there, the Bosnian Serb militia, is the Army of Republika Srpska, or the VRS. I'm just going to say VRS because it's much easier. That's a lot of vowels for my non-native English. And they are supported by the Yugoslav People's Army as well, the JNA, which is the Serbian army. So the Bosnians don't really have an outside force coming to help them. Bosnian Croats have the support from Croatia, and Bosnian Serbs have the support from Serbia. So it is very important to understand that a lot of times I'm going to be talking about the VRS, that Republika Srpska. They are going to be the driving force. They are going to be the ones that are going to lead the genocide with the support from Serbia. Milosevic, as the leader of Serbia, is going to promote it. But he is going to rely on these Bosnian Serb militias to commit the genocide. Although a lot of the tanks, the ammunition, the support is going to be coming from Serbia and is going to be provided by high-ranking generals such as Mladic from the JNA, from the Serbian army as well. So keep that in mind, that while I'm going to talk a lot, this is the VRS doing this, this is this doing this, this is these Bosnian Serb militias doing this. Be aware that they're continuously being armed and being supported by Serbia. So Before we get to the events of Srebrenica and what is usually labeled the genocide, I want to look what is usually labeled at this time period of ethnic cleansing, and especially to the region of Prijedor, which is a northern area closer to Croatia. Because in the Prijedor region, we definitely see that genocide is committed there, and we see if you put the stages on there, if you look at the process, how genocide was implemented there, you can see the really clear pattern of the 10 stages. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and I want to show you how that is set up and how that impacts the rest of Bosnia as well. So Bosnian Serbs in the area of Prijedor were focused on fully eliminating, removing Bosniaks and Bosnian Croats from this area. There was about 50,000 Bosniaks in the Prijedor region and about approximately 6,000 Bosnian Croats. This region had one of the highest rates of murder after the Srebrenica massacre. And I'm going to give you the numbers at the end of what happened in Prijedor and the impact of the genocide. So very rapidly, starting in 1992, when Bosnia was officially recognized, the impact in Prijedor was immediately visible. Serb propaganda increased very rapidly. They started taking over newspapers, the Radio Prijedor basically became a Serbian radio station. And they were continuously calling out allegations against non-Serbs, attacking Muslims, calling them Mujahideen, attacking Croats, calling them Ustaše. I told you that term would come back again. And they would continuously shout these insults and dehumanizing terms to label non-Serb populations here. The TV station was actually taken over, and all Bosnian broadcasts were replaced by broadcasts from Belgrade, from Serbia, to come in, which came with a lot of nationalistic songs and only Serbian spoken, and that being the main focus. So immediately it was polarizing. It was using as much propaganda as possible to split these groups in two and to encourage that nationalistic view amongst Bosnian Serbs. Then the stage of organization also started overlapping with it. On April 23rd, 1992, the Serbian Democratic Party in this area decided that all Serb units immediately had to start working on a takeover of the municipality, basically of the government in this area, and that they would have to work with the Serbian army, the Yugoslav People's Army, and to create their own units, their own militias in there that would work hand in hand. And then once that was established, once kind of these militias were established that were connected to the Yugoslav People's Army, a full takeover was happened on April 29 to 30 in 1992. Police stations were created that were fully led by Bosnian Serbs and by Serbs as well. The objective for that was to basically take over all elements of government and remove with that anybody that was not Serb. So this included taking over functions such as, basic functions like the post office, the chief of police, mayors. All different parts of government were slowly being taken over and were turned Serb. And Polly asked, the map on the screen right now, is that Bosnia? Yes, that is Bosnia. So that little blue area, that is Prijedor within Bosnia. Really quickly after that, we see the quick implementation of the stage of discrimination. Now that the takeover had happened, is quickly different laws, different orders were passed that removed all non-Serbs from any political position. Ministry of Interior, public utilities, any kind of state institution. And remember, this area is mainly a very socialist area, very government run. So a lot of these companies are state-run companies that were being taken over, and where if you were not of Serb nationality, or you could not show that you were ethnically Serb, you were being removed from that position. On top of that, by May 31st in 1992, the announcements started happening on the broadcasting and requiring that all non-Serbs have to show their allegiance to the Serbian state, to Serbian authorities. And the way they could do that was by marking their houses with white sheets, and marking their houses with, white sheets, the windows, putting it on the roof, putting it on the door. And when they went out wearing these white armbands, you can see actually a gentleman here wearing a white armband. And this was to show that loyalty. In reality, really what it is, it was a stage of symbolization. Basically, they were marking their victims already at this point, so they could see who was Serb and who was non-Serb, who was Croat and who was Bosniak, who was Muslim. And it made it very clear to target which homes were non-Serb homes, which places were non-Serb places, and who on the street was non-Serb and was Serb. So it became an easy form of marking the victim. And that is something that is often not talked about, this stage of symbolization, which is such a key marker oftentimes within the process of genocide. All these different steps, from removing people from office, restricting movement, all these different parts. Other parts you can see here on this too is starting the destruction of religious institutions, destroying mosques, bombing them, breaking them down, burning them, which you can see in the background as well. So slowly that persecution system was building and building and building. With that, soon after that, we start seeing this movement from not just marking, not just implementing a system of persecution and discrimination, but actually enacting that. Left and rights now, we shift to that full stage of persecution, where starting in the summer of 92 through 93, see massacres happen, where especially men are rounded up and they are executed. There are several of these places, from Kozarak, Bershevo, that we see these big massacres happen. But also something that is frequently ignored during the Bosnian Genocide is the establishment of concentration camps. Camps are built throughout. In May, Karen Term opens, which was a large factory, which actually had a whole room dedicated to, was known as room 3, which was used for execution and murder. The Marska camp was a mining complex that was actually filmed by journalists and then later closed, but where people were forced into slave labor. So these camps were very harsh conditions, were containing camps, basically concentration camps. You can see their barbed wire then, with horrible living conditions, starvation, forced slave labor. You can see these images right here. If women and children were in these camps, extreme high amounts of rape happened here as well. And that is a very key marker of the Bosnian Genocide. So rape became a very big tool in it. It was also a dehumanizing tool, especially for women and girls, because if they were raped, especially if they were Muslim, they would be usually ousted from their community as well, being seen as unclean and not worthy of marriage. So that had a religious dehumanizing factor in a sense as well. So rape was an immense, in a sense, genocidal tool in that too. It almost marked the end of that woman's life within their community. So approximately about 5,000 prisoners went through the Trepnopole camp as well. So different one of these camps opened up. And then finally, there's another stage that really starts occurring in 92 already, is the stage of denial. And one of the things that when we look at the process of genocide, that Dr. Stanton, when he developed the 10 stages, always talked about is that denial is a great indicator that genocide is occurring and that more atrocities will happen, that genocide will likely occur again. And it is definitely the case with Prejador. Radovan Karadzic, who is the political leadership of Bosnian Serbs, was interviewed in 1992 by British media, and he was questions about these camps, right? The British media had been there, they see these images. These images were out there, and he denied all of it. He denied the atrocities. He invited, of course, they cleaned up the camps, they invited them in, and even denied it after these crews captured some of these images of these emaciated prisoners behind barbed wire fences. He still denied it, that this was going on. So that is something that is important to recognize, that we already have that stage of denial happening before we get to the genocide at Srebrenica. So just to give you some numbers on Prejador. Remember this, there was about 50,000 Bosniaks in this area before the war, and about 6,000 Croats. And after the war, non-Serbs after the war, of those 50,000, there's only about 6,000 Bosniaks left and 3,000 Croats, so about half of Croats left too. During this time, not only are the Bosniaks attacked by the Serbs, but also by Croats that committed atrocities as well. The official missing/murder number is because a lot of times bodies could not be identified, victims could not be identified, or people went missing and there was just no trace of them. Was 3,515 Bosniaks, 186 Croats, and 78 Serbs. Croats, of course, being able to flee to Croatia and go to safety there, so many refugees. And this is really going to kick off the refugee crisis as well that will exist in Bosnia. And I remember, you know, I was young, I was a teen when this happened, but I'm from Belgium originally, and I lived in Antwerp, which is a large port, and so refugees frequently come through there, definitely in hopes of getting to England especially. And I remember, you know, very vividly these images starting in 92, 93 of refugees arriving from Bosnia from this time period. So the expulsion, right? This is where we talk about that difference between ethnic cleansing and genocide. Is this genocide? Is this ethnic cleansing? This is why I want to rather talk about the process, right? Because you can see that people are pushed out. They're forced into refugees. They're pushed out of this area too, but they're also being murdered. So it is that combination here. So in the end, 96 mass graves have been identified with about 2,100 victims in them. A lot of that work you can see here is being done. One of the techniques that the Bosnian Serb and the Bosnian Serb militias and the Serbian army used was with bulldozers to go through these mass graves frequently and spread any evidence out, so it would be very difficult to identify who was who. So one marker of the Bosnian genocide that you'll frequently see are these green coffins. That is when bodies of these mass graves are identified. Their remnants are put back together in a coffin in these green coffins. And then these mass burials, these mass ceremonies happen, what you can see here. And still today, you know, that is kind of a marker. And and is often a sign when you see images from the Bosnian genocide. You'll see these endless forensic teams coming in and trying to identify remains, and then these mass burials afterwards and ceremonies. So this is a little bit our map again of Bosnia. With the events happening, and Prejador is just one example, right? You can see that the VRS has control, it has, this pink area will be controlled by Bosnian Serb militias. And the green is held by Bosnian troops. And then you can see Croat militias having the yellow. So the pink area is all held by these Bosnian Serb militias and is under control of Serbia. And you can see Prejador falls right here, but it's not the only area, right? A lot of these areas are going to see that process of genocide being enacted. The result is that populations from these areas like Prejador are fleeing towards these green zones, right? These zones controlled by the Bosnian government. And in some of these areas, to get that, you have these little bubbles, right, that are fully surrounded. So the United Nations basically stepped in, and as people were fleeing for safety to these Bosnia-controlled areas, they got support from the United Nations, who created 6 what is called safe zones. These would come over under UN protection and basically were Bosnian-controlled territory where the Bosnian Serb militias were not allowed to enter. You can see a safe zone was created around Sarajevo, Gorazde, Zepa, and which we will be looking at in just a little bit here is Srebrenica. That is the big one. That is where the genocide, or what is officially labeled as the genocide, will happen. And so basically the UN peacekeepers had the duty here to protect these areas by all means, including force. So they had authority to use force to protect these safe zones. And of course, that created a lot of hope for safety, right? But still, it was immensely dangerous to get to these safe zones. There was Serbian snipers continuously attacking civilians. And even once you were in the safe zone, they were fully surrounded. And oftentimes there were Serbian snipers attacking, and there was continuous war on the borders of these safe zones occurring as well. When these safe zones were attacked, and it was defined that the UN peacekeepers were to protect these with all means, what was not defined is what officially makes this a safe zone, right? Whose job is it to keep this area, and how much force, if you say by all force necessary, how much force can actually be used? 34,000 UN troops were requested. Most countries actually refused to come to the aid. In the end, 7,300 troops were authorized by UN Council, and only 3,500 were deployed that are going to actually help protect. So the peacekeepers were immensely understaffed, undermanned to protect these safe zones. So as a result, they became these tiny little pockets of, in a sense, being able to stay alive, but there was, they literally became almost independent pockets too. They couldn't, interact with each other. Serbs, the Bosnian Serbs, blocked all kind of humanitarian aid between these areas. So if you were in Zepa or Gorazde or Srebrenica, no aid could come in. Water couldn't come in. Mail couldn't come in because it was fully blocked. So while this area basically in the center was blocked, People were overcrowded in there. There wasn't enough food coming in. And this created very dire situations within the safe zone. And the Serbs knew this. They knew that this was happening. They realized what they were doing, that basically they were laying sieges on these safe zones. And so what was created here really were, in a sense, sieges, and that eventually would collapse. And they frequently would laugh about this, even when they were being interviewed by media, that this was kind of a cat and mouse hunting game, that, you know, the mice were trapped and the cat was stalking around it. And this is really important to understand, because this, of course, aggravated the situation too by Bosniaks trying to arm and defend themselves and attacking back, stealing crops when they could get out to feed their families with inside these safe zones. Increase of prostitution and acts of violence within the safe zones as well. And you can see some of these images here of people fleeing to this safe zone. You can see the peacekeepers in the background and people just crowding together in different places, in mosques, in basically what they called the enclaves of Srebrenica, Zepa, Gorace, Sarajevo, in these areas. And I'm hoping this is gonna work, fingers crossed. I might have to share and unshare the screen, but I am hoping to show a news report, because this is when the world really starts paying attention. Sorry, I'm gonna stop my share for just a second and making sure when I'm sharing that my sound is playing too.
We see a cute picture of your daughter, Charlotte, but not the browser.
Sorry. There we go. Now?
Yeah, we're good now. Let's see if we can get the sound.
Now I can't find the play button. What is going on here? Sorry about that.
Numbing us with its relentlessness. But we get shocked anew each time we see the pictures. And today, for the first time, we get a glimpse of life in eastern Bosnia, the isolated mountainous area where thousands of Muslim refugees are slowly starving, as the United States searches for ways to get food to the people without getting involved in their war. When the Serbs refused to let United Nations relief trucks travel into the Muslim areas of eastern Bosnia, the U.S. started dropping supplies from the sky. For weeks now, the U.S. Air Force, flying out of Rhein-Main Air Force Base, has carried tons of food and medicine to the people of Bosnia, while the American people wonder whether the supplies are getting through, whether they're doing any good, and whether any of the factions have devised a way to use food as a weapon. We've seen the eerie pictures of American planes dropping their bulky beacons of survival. Tonight, we see where the parcels land, and surprisingly, the first sign of an American military man on the ground in eastern Bosnia. He's witnessed the impact of the airdrops. These scenes come to us from the town of Srebrenica, a place almost impossible to get to. ABC's Tony Bertley finally managed it last week, in what can only be described as an heroic effort to let us see what's happening in Srebrenica. Tony traveled by foot and by horseback to get into the isolated area. Since he arrived, he's run out of food and been injured by Serbian fire. But still, he smuggled out the story.
Nightfall in Srebrenica, and people light fires on the streets and the hillsides to wait for what they call the planes from God. After 11 months under Serbian siege, the U.S. airdrops of humanitarian aid are their only lifeline. In the dead of night, they make their way to the place where the prepared meals have landed, most often on steep-sided hills where people have to crawl up on their hands and knees. For some, like this lady, it's too much. She collapsed from exhaustion. The shape of a U.S. parachute hanging in the trees, showing the drop spot. Gunfire echoes around as the army try to control the people and the supplies.
I found this about 600 yards uphill. I don't know what it is. It could be medicine or something.
The lucky ones clutch their treasure package of 12 meals and head home. But in the morning, the empty packets lying on the mountain track showing that some were so desperate for food they couldn't wait. American planes have successfully airdropped aid into this area for the last 5 nights running. But villagers say they've received only one prepared lunch packet. The rest has been taken by the army. Most people have been eating only bread made from hay and corn for the last 2 months. That has finished. They now make it from the flour from a hazelnut tree. The father of this family demonstrates how much weight he has lost in the last 11 months. It is not a famine situation here, but it can be best described as slow starvation.
This is what I eat. This is what we eat.
We've got nothing to eat. We're starving to death.
So I just wanted to share this news report with you because it just showed this is definitely a genocide where you know, the rest of the world was watching this. Journalists were there on the ground. We're trying to get in. We're trying to get footage out. So I remember, again, as a young girl watching this footage as well, and looking that up. Polly, you can just in YouTube search news report Bosnian War or Siege of Srebrenica or Bosnian Genocide, and you'll get all these reports from that, including this one, but with it as well. So originally Srebrenica, the safe zone, had about 10,000 residents in it. Because of the refugees coming in, it had grown to 60,000, 6 times the size. And it was under continuous siege until 1995, with limited food supplies, with limited, even mail coming in, very limited medical supplies coming in. There was very little ammunition left, so that Bosniaks couldn't fight back. So even the Bosnian troops and militias were really outnumbered as well and had very little to fight back with. 600 Dutch peacekeepers were sent in to safeguard the city. And slowly, you know, the situation was coming very, very dear. After a while, some of the peacekeepers, and they're called, by the way, the Dutch Bats, because they were mainly Dutch peacekeepers, so it's called the Dutch Battalion or the Dutch Bats. They dropped from 600 to 400 because as the peacekeepers went on leave, they couldn't even get back in. So the numbers kept dropping and dropping too. So at the Dutch Bat headquarters, there, you know, you can see the pavilion right here. There was very little support. They had very little manpower, and the Bosnian Serbs, under the leadership of Karadzic, were very aware of that. They knew, you know, as you can see, some of the Dutch Bats standing here with people here under siege behind them. They knew that this is what the situation in Srebrenica looked like. So in March of 1995, Karadzic, again, the president, the leader of the Bosnian Serbs, gave really a directive called Directive 7 to start the invasion and the physical separation of Srebrenica from Zepa to prevent any communication between these two enclaves, between these two safe zones. And so that they could start with the move of taking over Srebrenica, and as you can see, creating total situation of total insecurity with no hope of future survival of life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica. So again, a very clear indicator with that. Karadzic was very aware what this meant. Even some of the military leadership pointed out to him that if this would happen, this would mean genocide. If troops eventually would move in after given this directive, that very likely the population within Srebrenica, the Bosniaks, would be murdered out. And so on July 6th, the offensive, the VRS, the Bosnian Serb militias, started moving towards the safe zone. Very quickly on that day already, several of the UN observation posts fell. The peacekeepers, the Dutch soldiers who were there, some of them retreated, but many also surrendered to Serbian troops. Bosniak militias trying to fight back had to retreat as quickly as back again. One of the refugee camps on the outside perimeter, which was a Swedish housing complex, was so quickly overrun that not everybody was even able to flee. And already starting on July 6th, rumors and sounds of execution started, and reports started coming from that refugee housing complex there that people were being executed. By July 8th, the Dutch BAT armored vehicles, these, you can see them sitting in this image right here, which is kind of iconic mark. You can see them, that were sent in to protect, to safeguard, right? By all means necessary. Actually didn't go in, but they started retreating as well. And the Bosniaks, the people there were, you can see in here, were trying to actually prevent this from happening. So because they knew that if the Dutch BAT started retreating, that everybody else had to retreat with them, because otherwise there would be no defense. By July 9th, Karadzic gave the order for the full capture by the VRS of Srebrenica. And so the full move into Srebrenica, not just taking the perimeter, but everything started on July 10th. But by July 9th, Lieutenant Colonel Karamans, the lieutenant in charge of the Dutch BATs, gave the urgent request for air support from NATO to defend Srebrenica. And NATO on July 11th did start an airstrike against Bosnian Serb troops overtaking Srebrenica, but they canceled it before poor visibility. And the VRS, Karadzic, actually made the threat that if NATO kept bombing Srebrenica, if they kept bombing Serb troops, that they would kill the Dutch peacekeepers, and they also had some French military hostages as well, that they would kill them. Remember, this is also in the background of Rwanda, where Belgian peacekeepers had been murdered as well. So this stopped the bombing this stops basically the airstrikes by NATO at this point. So all of this, remember, starts on July 6th. By July 11th in the afternoon, Melodic and all the other VRS generals were walking through the streets. Melodic was actually filmed drinking with Koramans, where in the evening where the leader of the Dutch BATs was trying to negotiate the fate of the civilians within Srebrenica. But on camera, what you can see is him toasting with these VRS generals and toasting and celebrating the victory at Srebrenica. But his hope was really to come to some agreement, to come to the protection. And this really happens. So Srebrenica fell very, very quickly. And with that, it was by July 11th, it was captured. And from the capture, we moved immediately to mass expulsion and execution. And with that, the genocide really starts taking place. And just to give you an idea of how aware the Serbian leadership was that this was going to be happen. Mladic, who led the Bosnian Serb militias, the general who led the Bosnian Serb militias, warned Milosevic and Karadzic that if they did this, this would be genocide. He confessed eventually at trial, saying, people are not little stones or keys in someone's pocket that can be moved from one place to another place, just like that. Therefore, we cannot precisely arrange for only Serbs to stay in one part of the country while removing others painlessly. I don't know what Mr. Karadzic will explain that to the world, but this is genocide. So they were very aware of what was happening. So refugees started flooding in, already in this overcrowded city. They were fleeing as quickly as possible to safety to the UN compound at Potokari to find maybe some protection from the Dutch bat soldiers and get protection there. About 20 to 25,000 approximately Bosniaks were gathered there seeking the protection. And this was like a compound of factories and fields and different areas. The majority of the people seeking refuge there were women and children, but there were men there as well. Starting on July 12th, as everybody was trying to find refuge in the Potokari complex, the VRS started burning down several areas, started executions, started rounding up men, even within the Potokari complex, and started terrorizing basically the whole area. Survivors frequently give testimony from that very early time on July 12th that there was this continuous attacks, continuous sound of execution going on, of buildings being set on fire, women being raped, children being murdered. You can find, there's endless testimonies of this, of what was happening. And by July 12th, slowly over the day, the Serb forces started also separating any men from the women over time and starting to hold them in separate locations. Karaman had come to some kind of negotiation that women and children eventually would be allowed to leave the safe zone to other safe zones, and that buses would arrive at Potokari to take them away. And that's the scene. What you can see here is where women and children were allowed to leave. And of course, men, knowing that if they stayed behind, they were most likely going to be executed, tried to get on board too, tried to get to safety as well, but they would be pulled off. They would be brought to a building which was called the White House and would be executed there. In the end, at Potokari, by July 16th, by the end of the massacre, 8,000 men and boys were murdered. Many, many women were tortured, were cut, were sliced. Many were raped. Horrible scenes of rape and sexual violence throughout. Stories of hopelessness that just are still survivors talk about when it comes to Srebrenica. And you can see here, this is the compound at Potokari right here, right, where most of the people were congregated. You can actually see the buses lined up that were used to take some of the women and the children out. And then the White House right here, where men were taken to be executed. And you can see some of the images here as well, and just people fleeing in and trying to come to safety here still on the 12th, and then the executions starting to happen here, and people and the women being bussed out. Meanwhile, on July 11th, while many of the women and children were fleeing to Potokari, some of the men decided that if they went to Potokari, that they were very likely going to be executed by the Serbs. So they didn't see their defense in hiding behind the Dutch bats, who really did nothing. When men were executed, when women were raped, the Dutch Baths did nothing. That is a whole separate story, and there's a whole different part to the Bosnian Genocide about the reaction of the Dutch Baths during this time. But some of the men, they realized that they could not find protection there at the UN compound. So they decided that they would break through the safe zone line through the Serb forces and form a column and push through that and try to find their way to another safe zone. So on July 11th, they gathered all able-bodied men and they started forming this column and started pushing through the VRS lines, the Bosnian Serb militia lines, in the hope that they would have a better chance. But they were immensely, overpowered by the VRS. There was lack of sleep, dehydration, immense exhaustions that immediately started impacting the cohesion of the column. So it started to splitting up. And the VRS noticed that. They first let them split up a little bit, and then they would attack them. They would execute people. They would continuously shell them. They would shoot at them. They would snipe at them. They would actually dress up like Bosniaks and then would come close and would execute people. They would shell them with chemical weapons to create disorientation and hallucinations. And so the column more and more started breaking off, which led to some big mass executions along the way. In the end, only 1/3 of the men that left made it eventually, the part of that column, 1/3 only made it to the safe zone. So 2/3 went missing or were executed along the way, going to safety. Meanwhile, throughout Srebrenica, continuous mass executions happened until full control, basically, the Srebrenica was fully seen as Serbian territory. The Bosnian Wars technically end in November of 1995 with the signing of the Dayton Accords in Dayton, Ohio. This created a peace agreement that established 2 semi-autonomous states within Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, inhabited by Bosniaks and Bosnian Croats, under a mixed leadership of Bosniaks and Croats, and the Republika Srpska, or the which includes Srebrenica today, which is dominated by Serbs. And the idea was that over time, they would start working together and that they would start overcoming some of their ethnical and religious differences and work together. Part of the peace agreement was that refugees would have the right to return to their pre-war homes. But that did not happen. Most Bosniaks, for obvious reasons, did not choose to go back to Srebrenica, to go back under Serbian control. And if they did go back, or they did try to go back, their homes and their communities were inhabited by Bosnian Serbs. So this made it very complex too, and in a sense created divisions within Bosnia. So the Dayton Accords were meant always as a band-aid solution. It was not meant as long-term. The idea was that it would motivate some kind of negotiation and would create some kind of unity within Bosnia-Herzegovina. But that didn't happen. People still today identify ethnically rather than by citizenship. They live still very segregated lives, and there is still a lot of hateful rhetoric amongst the different ethnic groups. The result has been that Bosnia-Herzegovina is economically really behind its Balkan counterparts. It is hit by throughout the years, immense unemployment. It has faced a lot of government corruption as well, and has really weakened Bosnia-Herzegovina in that sense. So while no big mass atrocities are happening there, and there is some sense of stability, the tension definitely is not gone with that. Already before the war ended in '93, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 827, which established the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. And this really brought some of the big war criminals like Milosevic, who you can see here, to trial. More than 160 people were charged, Serbs, Bosnians, and Croats. Remember, because the Croats also committed atrocities as well. Milosevic was indicted for 3 war crimes and crimes against humanity for Kosovo, war crimes and crimes against humanity in Croatia, and genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes in Bosnia. He pled originally guilty to all 66 accounts, but was found guilty, and in 2006 actually was found dead in his cell. Mladic, the general who had led the offensive on Srebrenica and most of the Bosnian war for the Bosnian Serbs, had evaded arrest for a while, but was caught and brought to trial in 2012. He was convicted of 10 charges, including 1 count of genocide, and always kept throughout his defense that he was just following orders, which is very common for those who commit genocide, is using the excuse, oh, I was just following orders. He was sentenced to life in prison. Karadzic, who was the president of the Bosnian Serb government, was also fugitive. He was put on trial as well and was also sentenced to life, and very hard fought it, and still does not to today admit his guilt. Just to show that Croats were also convicted as well. Most recently, probably in 2017, you might remember the famous scene of the suicide in the ICTY courtroom. That was Pralak, a Croat general who was convicted of war crimes against Bosniaks in Bosnia. And he committed suicide after an appeal to overturn his conviction was denied. Just to kind of wrap it up, over 20,000 people are still missing. President Bill Clinton founded the International Commission on Missing Persons, which does forensic searches to find missing people in disaster zones. And the area around Srebrenica is one of the main areas that they do work with and where that forensic science is still being conducted today to help identify victims and give them a proper burial. So I would say, that there is a lot of big change that happened. We can look at stories where Rwanda, where we see like this economic revival in Rwanda and the stability that's created. That is not necessarily the case for Bosnia. Again, this was just an overview, but there's so much more to this from the different parts of Bosnia that you can more study, to the different people involved in it, to the different groups. You can more look at the Croat aspect of it versus Bosniaks. You can look a little bit more in the behavior of the Dutch Bats in the United Nations. So I wanted to share with you these resources right here. There is a documentary available on YouTube. You can just Google it as Srebrenica Genocide, No Room for Denial is the best way to find it. Then there's also the Bosnian American Genocide Institute and Education Center that you can look up. They have tons of information as well. And then the Srebrenica Memorial as well. They have a wonderful website. Again, you can just Google Srebrenica Memorial and it will pop up, and is another resource. But you're welcome to also take a picture of this slide if you want to have these links available as well. So these are some other resources. Again, there's many other places where you can go search for that. The United States Holocaust Museum has some information. The Educator Institute for Human Rights. But these are some other resources where if you're interested in learning more that you can explore too. Our museum also has one of our 10 stages of genocide graphic novels. Also, one of the graphic novels is focused on the stage of discrimination and focuses on the genocide in Bosnia and recounts a lot of that in graphic novel style, the history that I just gave right now. And again, we have a full island dedicated to the Bosnian Genocide and to Srebrenica in our museum as well. So I apologize for going way over time, but are there any questions? Okay, thank you for sticking in there, and I hope this was helpful and informational. I know it was a lot of facts and a lot of different things thrown out there. As I said, I'm not an expert myself, but I tried to gather some of the core basic information to help you as much as possible and highlight some of the different aspects of the genocide in Bosnia.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. I know that's a lot to cover, but I think you did a great job. We're getting some thank yous for you in the comments here. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. As always, please feel free to visit our website, dhhrm.org, for all upcoming programs. Be well, be safe, and we'll see you next time.